Hi there, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the strategic lessons of revolutionary democracy. So first off, let's start off with a description of the format. So first we'll have our panelists respond to a prompt that we devised. 10, 15 minutes, but quite frankly, won't be too strict about time. And then the hope is that after that, the panelists can respond to each other. We'll take 2 rounds of responses, and then we'll do a Q&A for about an hour. So as for questions, the format is that we ask you to write your question in the chat. And then we will ask you if you would like to, pose the question yourself, or whether or not you would like us to read it. At that point, once it's the Q&A, we will call your name, and if you want to speak, we will unmute you, or else we'll say the question is from this person, and we will ask your question. So without further ado, so my name is Jamil, and I'll be your host chair. And our panelists today, and I want to thank them for being here, are Eric Blanc, Ben Lewis, and Gil Schaeffer. So Eric Blanc is author of books Revolutionary Social Democracy, Working Class Politics Across the Russian Empire, 1882 to 1917, which is published by Brill in 2021, and Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave and Working Class Politics, which was published by Verso in 2019. So Eric Blanc is a doctoral candidate in sociology at NYU, researching public sector labor organizing, information and communications technology, and working class politics. His research has appeared in journals such as Politics and Society, New Labor Forum, and Labor Studies Journal, as well as publications such as The Nation, The Guardian, and Jacobin. Our next panelist is Ben Lewis, and he is a translator whose main area of research is the disputed legacy of Second International Marxism and its main theoretician, Karl Kautsky. He has written many articles on this subject and translated several key German language texts from this period. Together with historian Lars Lih, he has co-produced a book on the Halle Congress of the German USPD in 1920, Martov and Zinoviev, Head-to-Head and How. He sits on the Revolutionary History Editorial Board and on the Marxists Internet Archive Steering Committee. His current project, Marxism Translated, is dedicated to the translation and study of lost classic texts of German Marxism. His most recent book is an edited translation from Haymarket titled Karl Kautsky on Democracy and Republicanism. And our final panelist is Gil Schaeffer. He was a member of Students for Democratic Society at Princeton from 1967 to 1970, and of the Revolutionary Union in Oakland from 1970 to 1975. His paper, You Can't Use Weathermen to Show Which Way the Wind Blew, The Unfinished History of the New Left, Participatory Democracy, Marxism, and the Goal of a Democratic Constitution, critically investigates the history of the New Left, the relationship between democracy and Marxism. Other writings by Gil can be found at Cosmonaut New Politics. So now let's turn to the prompt. So while 20th century Marxism was largely founded on the politics and philosophy produced by the Communist International, 1919 and 1943, both academics and socialist militants have been reevaluating the typical narrative of the prior Second International, its relation to Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution, and its relevance to today. The Second International was made up of mass worker parties that largely subscribed to Marxism. Between its left flank, represented by people like Rosa Luxemburg and Anton Pannekow, and its right, symbolized by revisionist Edward Bernstein, plus trade union leaders like Philipp Scheidemann and Friedrich Ebert, it was a center Orthodox Marxist tendency, led by the likes of Karl Kautsky, Vladimir Lenin, and others that could be called revolutionary social democracy. So, what can socialists today take from revolutionary social democracy, either as a positive or a negative lesson? What does the nature of the contemporary liberal constitutional state imply for socialist strategy? The process of the working class building a class for itself and ultimately taking power in society. So now I want to open it up to the panelists, and I'm wondering, who would like to speak first, or whether we should just do it alphabetically, No? Okay. So does anyone have a preference?
I'm happy to go alphabetically, but is that me?
Go for it.
Seems like it doesn't want to. So would you like
I
to
would
go?
prefer to go after.
Okay. Yeah. Gil or?
Want me to go?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay, sure.
Sounds good.
Okay, so I wrote a little something in response to the cosmonaut announcement of this event. So I think the best way to outline my views on the strategic lessons to be drawn from Second International Social Democracy is to contrast them with Cosmonaut's framing of this question. Beginning with the title, Strategic Lessons of Revolutionary Social Democracy. I think calling Second International Social Democracy revolutionary is both redundant and confusing. It's redundant because the political goals of social democracy, the democratic republic, and socialism are already revolutionary in themselves. Putting the modifier revolutionary in front of socialism and democracy doesn't add anything to this political content. Now, the social democrats of the Second International sometimes did call themselves revolutionary social democrats to contrast themselves with Bernstein revisionism. But when they got to tactics, they would have to walk that back because they were not always in a revolutionary situation. And the tactics in non-revolutionary situations called for something different. And so Lenin in particular had to make this distinction, but Kautsky also did as well. Now it's confusing because the word revolutionary is also commonly used to refer to the specific tactics of armed insurrection. Now, mixing a specific tactic appropriate in only some rare circumstances with the permanent programmatic goals of democracy and socialism begs the question of what tactics are appropriate outside of the rare circumstances of outright revolutionary confrontation. Okay, so that's the first. A second difference with Cosmonaut's framing is their division of the Second International into three political groupings comprised of a right wing represented by Bernstein and conservative trade unionists, a left wing represented by Luxemburg and Panekowek, and an orthodox Marxist center that includes both Kautsky and Lenin. The split between Luxemburg and Kautsky into left and center positions only occurred in 1910 over the tactical question of whether to support the mass demonstrations and strikes demanding voting reform and a democratic republic. Prior to 1910, Kautsky, Luxemburg, Lenin, and Panekowek were all part of an orthodox social democratic mainstream. Although Lenin was not involved in the 1910 dispute between Luxemburg and Kautsky, by 1912, he had clearly sided with Panekowek against Kautsky's post-1909 electoral reformism. So it is also a mistake to group Lenin with Kautsky in an orthodox Marxist center against Rosa Luxemburg. The relevance of all this for us today in the US is that we don't live in a democracy either. And so the concerns of the Second International for the Democratic Republic they're just still relevant to us today. So one of my differences with Eric is that he insists on calling the US a capitalist democracy. Now, I think this is a debasement of the meaning of the word. And I think it has led him to distort the historical record regarding Kautsky's, Luxemburg's, and Lenin's views on democratic strategy and tactics. My differences with Ben have revolved around the adequacy of Lars Lih's concept of Erfurtianism, which was developed in his book, Lenin Rediscovered. The main flaws I find in Lih's book, it doesn't mention Engels' critique of the political part of the Erfurt program for not including the demand for a democratic republic. It doesn't mention that the demand for a democratic republic was the principal demand of the program of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And it doesn't mention that the aim of all of Lenin's political agitation in Iskra was to secure a democratic republic rather than just the civil and political freedoms that the German SPD enjoyed at the time. There was a discussion about 2 months ago that Haymarket Books put on the Second International, the same subject we're discussing today. It included Eric, Lars T Lih, Mike Tabor, and Anne McShane. And this blind spot, to me, was evident in that discussion because the Democratic Republic and the programs and activities of the Second International around the Democratic Republic was not mentioned. And the discussion slipped into the old rut of reform versus revolution. Okay. And so for me, on this entire subject, the dispute between Kautsky and Luxemburg over the tactics to be followed for the Democratic Republic is kind of the central issue. Luxemburg supported the strikes and demonstrations for a democratic republic. Kautsky's response, in the road to power, Kautsky had looked favorably on demonstrations in 1908 in Berlin. As you said, the first street demonstration since 1848 in Germany. He was enthusiastic about it. But in 1910, when those demonstrations broke out in much larger forms, he pulled back and he said, no, this will hurt our chances for gaining a majority in the elections to come in 1912. And to me, that's the main issue, the tactics that you follow to struggle for democracy. And I don't think either Ben or Eric discussed that event in German history. And so I think that's the central issue. Okay.
Thank you, Gil. Thank you. Who would like to go next? Ben or Eric?
Next, Eric, because you said you wanted to come in afterwards. Is that okay with you?
What's that? You can go for it.
Yeah, is that
Go
okay?
for it.
You said you wanted to come in afterwards. So
No, I'll go last. It's fine. Go ahead.
Awesome. Okay. Okay, thank you, comrades. I will just share my screen very briefly. I did prepare some slides just to kind of break up the Zoom monotony of looking at a picture of me. So yeah, let me just start the slides. This is me. My name is Ben Lewis. I am by day I teach German at university, and by night, Revolutionary Marxist translator and historian of the Second International. So I'm really pleased to be here on this panel. I'm really pleased in particular to discuss and debate these things with Gil and Eric. Eric, I know slightly better. Gil, we've had a few exchanges of letters in the past. Yeah, it's good to do these things in person, and I hope the discussions can continue. So yeah, just about me, this is some information. If you're interested in the Second International, you want to read all the hot stuff from the German party press that is not yet in English, then please consider becoming a patron of mine. And actually, one of the topics I've been working on recently is 1910 and all that. So I'll return to that in the course of the discussion. Just some very quick remarks at first about why the Second International, why this is becoming more of a feature of our discussions on the left today. I think people like Eric Blanc, I think people like Lars T Lih, my own little contributions as well, have really started to shift the discussion a little bit about the significance of the Second International. You could also mention people like Daniel Guido with their extensive translation work. But the point I would make more broadly is that we have to understand, we could turn the question around and say, why haven't we been discussing the Second International in more detail up until now? And that really is, I think, a reflection of the particular historical legacies and ideas and traditions that we've interpreted as the far left in the past 100 or so years. we have to be careful when approaching the Second International and Second International Marxism of kind of avoiding the danger of a teleological kind of reading backwards of things, right? So we all know that 1914, the Second International collapse, and oftentimes, as I'll explain in a second, this is explained away with reference to some kind of theoretical original sin in the program and the dialectics of the Second International, philosophy of the Second International, whatever that means. And what I would stress is that it's contingent. It was a contingent, living and breathing movement with all sorts of things going on. History could have turned out differently. And actually, if you look at this, the events in 1914, that's particularly strikingly the case. So yeah, my focus here in revolutionary social democracy is on the German-speaking sections, particularly the SPD, which is what I've been working on for maybe the past, I don't know, 10 years or something, on and off, in between everything else. But first, Gil brought this up in his talk, revolutionary social democracy, why the term, why is it significant? Well, the blurb kind of sets it out, really, is embodied by the tendency of these three men, not that we're going for kind of a strong man of history reading here, but if you know, I like this image as it summarizes some of the leaders of the orthodoxy, if you like, the majority of the Second International in its heyday. The Lenin Kautsky Babel tendency, and it's reflected, as we see in Mike Tabor's recent book, largely reflected these ideas in the resolutions passed by the International at the congresses it held across its years. Themes which I'll just explore and return to in a second: revolutionary patience, minimum maximum program, reforms but not reformism, class self-organization and independence, majority revolution, opposition to participation in bourgeois governments, and also known as coalitionism or Millerandism, and budget approvals. Also, I think this is maybe bounces off Gil's point slightly. The significance of the term is precisely that the international socialist movement is divided between two trends in particular. It's more complicated than that, and there's crossovers and all the rest of it, and the trends within trends, but the two main competing trends within the international are the revisionists and the revolutionary social democrats, and this in a constant battle over the ideas and focus of the international. And like the quote I like from Lenin, placing him and the Bolshevik faction in that tendency, the revolutionary social democratic tendency. He says, I answered Mr. Shriver at the time, when and where did I ever claim to have created any sort of special trend in international social democracy not identical with that of Babel and Kautsky? So that's the background to revolutionary social democracy. As Gil also pointed out, well, Gil didn't point this out, but after the Russian Revolution as well, after the First World War, after the Russian Revolution, there were various people in the Bolsheviks who still referred to the term, positively speaking, revolutionary social democracy when looking back on history. And yes, basically, my approach here, as I'll outline in a bit more detail in a second, is basically to follow Lenin, Zetkin, Zinoviev, and others who are in arguing that it was the majority of the Second International that broke with its principles, particularly in 1914, and it wasn't the Bolsheviks who suddenly burnt everything that they once held sacred to then become a revolutionary organization, develop revolutionary tactics or whatever to take power in 1917. And indeed, one of the things we should bear in mind when looking at these things is that the majority of those who joined what became the Communist International, for all its flaws and all the problems that we inherit from that as well, to a certain extent, they came from the split in social democracy and the left wing that opposed the war and organized around those politics. That's worth bearing in mind when we look back at the Second International Marxism. Just briefly, as the chair outlined, I have take a bit of an interest in Karl Kautsky and the relationship with Lenin. 1914, we all know the story, votes for war credits. Kautsky urges abstention. He's an advisor to the parliamentary faction of the SPD. He urges abstention, but loses out, and then he kind of seeks to uphold party unity in the face of that. Lenin hammers him for this, as is well known as the pamphlet on the right, as well as for his wavering on the German Revolution in 1918. And again, just to emphasize the point, for Lenin, it was Kautsky that broke with Kautsky himself, i.e. Kautsky in 1914 collapses as a thinker and has, as Gil pointed out as well, there are certain antecedents, certain signs of that beforehand of Kautsky's collapse as a revolutionary thinker. And what I argue, following Lars T Lih and others, is actually Lenin upholds the very best of that approach that we kind of learned from Kautsky and others in the Second International while they break with it. And the very famous quote, how well Kautsky wrote when he was a Marxist, Lenin in 1920, all of these references, positive references to Kautsky when he was a revolutionary. So Lenin breaks, Kautsky breaks with his ideas, Lenin hammers in for it, but he does so on the basis of, look, this is all the great stuff that you once wrote, look at what you're doing now. And again, we'll see some examples in a second of stuff that I've worked on that illustrate and kind of further that point in a sense. This is a quote from Lars Lih, Lenin reaffirming loyalty to revolutionary social democracy in 1917, a confirmation of the very best of revolutionary social democracy. But, and this is the important thing when we come to think about why the Second International, why does it potentially have lessons? Why might it not have lessons? Why have we not been discussing these things in more detail before? This is not how the Second International or the revolutionary social democracy, Bolshevism, came to be represented or remembered in the 20th century. So there's this kind of historical handing down and a certain distortion. Second International Marxism, SIC, as I say, in the 20th century. In my own research, I argue that three schools are particularly responsible for the distortion of the legacy of revolutionary social democracy. So it's portrayed not as a brilliant, inspiring revolutionary movement that's split pretty much along those lines of revolutionary reformist outlooks. Again, it's a bit more complicated than that, but as a way of stating it. But it was something always innately wrong with that movement itself. There was something crypto-reformist about it that would inevitably lead to 1914, to betrayal, to class compromise, and all the rest of it. Cold War Western historiography, quite clear in what it's trying to do there. It's trying to create a gulf between the experience of the Second International and, for example, experiences like the Bolshevik experience, etc. The Eastern Bloc's bastardization of Marxism, which is kind of the mirror image of that. So if you read the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union by Stalin, he's also very clear that when looking back over the party history, his rewriting of party history, we Bolsheviks never had anything to do with that crappy Second International. Lenin never had any time for Kautsky, blah, 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 blah. And again, it's creating that gulf between the experiences of the two for Stalin's own particular ends, for the ends of the Soviet Union bureaucracy in the last instance. There's also a Trotskyist mirror image of that, I would argue as well, that you find reflect. I mean, that's a particularly crass example of it, but Lenin and the Vanguard Party by Joseph Seymour, Spartacus pamphlet, again, echoing largely unconsciously the exact same arguments of one certain Joseph Stalin, and then what I call the neo-Hegelian distortion of Kautsky's legacy, which tends to look to Kautsky's lack of understanding of dialectics, philosophy, etc., in particular, as leading to the problems with the Second International face. So there's real historical factors at play here that have still influence our understanding of these things today. And for different reasons, but with similar outcomes, they all sought to create a gulf between Bolshevism and social democracy. As I would say, I have the opposite approach, which is actually that in many ways, 1917 was the confirmation, the living confirmation of the very best aspects of the Second International and the revolutionary social democracy. Okay, now we come to talk about what hopefully you can see that it's one of my favorite Kautsky memes. I'm a little bit too old for too many memes, but that's my favorite one in relation to Karl Kautsky. In 1904, as I outline in my book, for him, the Democratic Republic equals the Paris Commune, following Marx, critically leaning on Marx's arguments in the Civil War in Paris, etc. But by 1918, as a reflection of what I feel to be his collapse as a revolutionary thinker, he's then creating the Democratic Republic with Weimar Germany, right, which is it's a clear contrast and shift in thought, and we'll maybe look at that now. I wanted, obviously, as one of my fellow panelists here is Eric Blanc, I wanted to look at the Jacobins. So Jacobins probably, and Eric himself, probably one of the leading voices, I suppose, in reassessing or looking back favorably at the politics of the Second International. And there's a few things I'd like to pick out here that I think are problematic when looking back and maybe drawing the best of the revolutionary aspects of social democracy. I would say I have a lot of respect for Eric. I'm currently plowing my way through his book, and I think with the shift in focus he's brought about the Tsarist Empire as a whole is incredibly important work. I also think that it's very admirable command of various languages. I just about get by with English and German. And I think there's a lot of good stuff there. But we do see things rather differently, both historically and maybe today too. I would say that the Jacobin phenomenon to me is in part a very healthy reaction in some ways to some of the Trotskyist distortions of history that we've seen. I know Eric was a Lombardist in the past, etc., and the various other people in and around Jacobin who've come out of the Trotskyist movement, the Revolutionary Party and all that kind of stuff. So I think in one of the ways it's a healthy move. But I think, as I made clear actually in an interview with Jacobin, which we'll look at later, I think the baby is thrown out with the bathwater, so to speak. I think instead of being challenged, the kind of Leninism that was taught by these Trotskyist groups largely, and is kind of taken as read today on the left, is largely taken as good coin. So Lenin as the Blancist kind of insurrectionist movement, whereas the social democrat mass parties were democratic, etc., more propitious to working in democracies, or however you want to define the term, more democratic societies. I also think there's a certain, maybe it's a political judgment as well, there's a certain thing of saying, okay, the socialism so-called of AOC, Corbyn, Sanders, all this kind of stuff is maybe something we can tie this onto. But I think that when it comes to the Jacobin publication, there are some kind of mind-boggling analogies in history here. The equation, for example, of the squad with the Reichstag faction of the SPD under August Bebel, I think was a particular one you just think, oh dear. And again, the implicit line drawn between democratic socialism of the SPD, so-called, and the democratic socialism of Corbyn, Sanders, which is basically 21st century Millerandism at best, really. So that's problematic for me. And I would say that the broader historical point where Eric and I think differ on things like Kautsky, Lenin, etc., is that in many ways, what Blanc's work, what Eric's work does is to just give the Cold War consensus a slightly new gloss of paint. So there is still that implicit gulf, as I say, between Kautsky and Lenin, between the SPD center and the Bolsheviks in 1917. And what also I think doesn't work in not just in Eric's work, there's a guy, James Muldoon, who's an academic here in Exeter, wrote an article, I've linked it there, I'll put these slides up later for the comments to look at. It doesn't really account for this, what is this term Kautskyism, and what does it mean? It doesn't account for the shift or the collapse in Kautsky as a thinker between here 1904 and 1918. It's slightly slippy on that. And yes, so Muldoon, for example, in his article in Jacobin says, we want to reclaim the best of Kautsky, which I think is absolutely a valid way of assessing things. And I think there is a lot to learn. But then kind of proceeds to outline some of the very worst of Kautsky, i.e. when he's defending Weimar Republic as a kind of, the Weimar Germany as a kind of democratic republic, and embracing the anti-democratic separation of powers, which is something he absolutely, following Marx, rejected in his writings on the Commune in 1904, which are translated in my book. Is it a case of theory catching up with practice? I don't know. I mean, it'd be great to talk about these things with Eric and maybe other people who write for Jacobin or whatever. This distinction, I think Gill, I would echo what Gill said in his talk about that, the democratic states, I think absolutely, and we can sign up with Gill and I have differences, but I think that this would have to nowhere more relevant in terms of democratic republicanism than the USA. The USA clothes itself, it puts on the clothes of a democratic republic, but it's neither a democratic nor a republic, certainly not in Marxist terms. And some of the stuff I see then about high politics, revolutionary politics, maybe the masses aren't ready at the moment for that because we're in such a period of defeat, particularly worldwide, particularly in America. And Britain, the socialist ideas, the idea of socialism is coming back onto the agenda slightly, but the left is historically weak, etc. So we're kind of not, maybe we need to start somewhere and then kind of move closer towards socialist politics. I think that, unconsciously or otherwise, is largely a reflection of the revisionist ideas from social democracy. I've put my interview there with Jacobin, and I would just echo what I said there in that interview with David Broder. I think it's actually here, so it's good to see him. That basically, so in terms of the Jacobin project, maybe there's the implication, again, Eric can correct me if I'm wrong, we can discuss this back and forward. maybe the implication is that either because the SPD is a so-called capitalist democracy, which I actually don't think it is compared to autocratic Kaiserreich Germany in the early 20th century, or maybe because revolutionary ideas are so thoroughly discredited, maybe we should focus on these kind of bread and butter things, $15 minimum wage, Green New Deal, etc., and mobilizing the masses around that. And I would say that if it were so easy to get to socialism and we could do that, we would have got there a long time ago, because this has been tried and tried again. And I think maybe there's a sense here of comrades setting out on new political territory, seeing the vistas that would open up around the Sanders movement, etc., and maybe trying to imbue that with a certain historical legitimacy from the aspect of Marxism, which I think is problematic. I've gone on quite long, so I'll just look at. I mean, this is not an intervention in what kind of party we need or anything. I wanted to focus more about the historical aspects and some of the things we can learn potentially. This is not a historical reenactment society, in my view. It's not about the Second International had its own particular formation, which is complex and which will never be repeated, I would argue. I think we'd have to take a new form, etc. But it's looking to see what was some of the best stuff that came out of it. Also, by the way, it also means looking at the revisionist arguments and seeing what they exactly had to say, because most of this stuff is untranslated. You often get some Luxembourg and all the rest of it, but you really need to go back to these debates and see what was happening, because I think, as you see in the resolutions from Mike Tabor's book as well, is that a lot of the discussions here that were had in those times actually echo many of the discussions we're having today. They're on a much higher political level, I would argue, with much higher political organization and all the rest of it. But I think there's a lot there to get our teeth into, and the more we can familiarize ourselves with this work, the better. Class independence from other political parties, ambition, creation of an alternative state within state, elections and parliamentary representatives. I think we would all agree, certainly Eric and I would agree, that for too long the left has kind of downplayed and soft pedaled electoralism and standing for politics on an electoral platform, but also rejecting electoralism or parliamentarism per se would be my approach. Class organization central, party is central to it, political parties, but not the kind of Stalinoid Trotskyist parties of a new type, all that stuff that we've acquired in our far left mother's milk, as it were, when looking at these things. And programmatic commitment and acceptance, not ideological shibboleths and parroting. I think that's also important. Reforms, but not reformism. One thing which I think is very important, and I want to stress, is the openness of political culture and rigorous debate. I'm currently translating a load of Rosa Luxemburg, and most of her stuff is just debating and criticizing other people in the movement, particularly on the right, but also sometimes on the left and elsewhere. It's somehow being passed down to us, again, as a product of defeat. I think that the frank and rigorous exchange of opinions is somehow sectarian or fighting among ourselves or a distraction from working among the masses. But I would say actually it was a fundamental part of the socialist self-understanding and work and agitation of the Second International, that it had this kind of culture. And some people have raised the issue of, okay, what did the workers who ascribed to social democracy actually read? Did they read Marx? And some people said they've gone away, looked at the libraries, entrepreneurs said, well, yeah, not a lot of Marx was read. But I would make this point. If you look at the left press of the time, say of the SPD, it was incredibly lively, incredibly educational, incredibly polemical at times. And I think that is actually where many of the cadres were schooled and the activists were trained, etc., with such a great press. And reading Rosa Luxemburg's article, she has a feature called Aus der Partei, latest from the party, where she just picks up news items, criticizes ex-comrade, raises this discussion here, etc., etc. Patience, I think that's important, and Marxist republicanism. How am I looking for time, Tish? Shall I wrap up in a second? I think I've probably gone over, right? I didn't.
Yeah, it's okay, but if you could.
I'll wind up in a second, because I've obviously taken on a little bit more than can fit in the time. Patience and education, agitation and organization, not just agitation, looking for the latest kind of link in the chain to bring the movement forward. Actually, you need to step back a bit and provide an alternative vision. And again, this is where I chime in with Gil, the significance of Marxist republicanism. The revolutionary social democracy was characterized by the refusal to take responsibility for capitalist state regimes or budgets, not a penny, not a man, right? In the language of the time. And I think that's absolutely crucial to building class political independence. It says, look, we do not want any truck with this capitalist system. We want to transform the entire thing top to bottom. That means not just electoral work. It means actually abolishing the army. It means completely overhauling the state bureaucracy, and having that as the framework within which you do your politics is absolutely essential, in my opinion. And yeah, I talk about Lenin in 1917 as a great example of not taking power in government after April. Really helps out. Also, and I know this is a question in America at the moment, the DSA, republicanism within the movement itself, recallability, open debate, and keeping particularly MPs in line. And I've got some lovely Rosa Luxemburg quotes on keeping MPs in line. But when it comes to flaunting the principles of the organization and what to do about it. So I think I have some negative lessons, and I have some Luxembourg stuff, and I do want to talk about 1910 and 1912. I've just written that up in response to Gil, but I think I'll end my presentation there. Let Derek come in, and then we can carry on with the discussion. So thank you, comrades, for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Very comprehensive. So now we have Eric Blanc. If he would, go for it.
Yeah. Hi, everyone out there in the world. And I want to thank Cosmonaut and Gil and Ben, who actually I probably agree on more on some of the historical things than maybe you're aware of. And on a lot of the political things, actually, I think we probably agree on too. So I want to clarify where I agree, where we disagree. Because there's, how it is on the left, there's a decent amount of talking past each other. And so in that spirit, I try to remain comradely and dig into this, because there is relevant strategic lessons one way or the other on how you dig into this history. This is a little bit, in part because I wanted to be a dialogue with Gil and Ben, this is less systematic than a presentation, because I kind of want to respond and touch on the points. So apologies in advance for any incoherence. But, the big, what is the big story I tried to tell in the book I wrote? So I wrote this big, long book that's going to be out in paperback in a couple months. I'll drop a link in if you want to get it, called Revolutionary Social Democracy. It looks at the revolutionary social democrats, which is to say the left of the Second International as a shorthand in the Tsarist Empire. And in its thesis, which I think I proved, and tell me if you agree, is that if you look at the empire as a whole, it proves that there was not a real specificity and uniqueness of the Bolsheviks per se. They were trying to implement revolutionary social democracy, but they were doing it in an autocratic context. And so it turns out, if you look at the empire as a whole, there's a lot of parties that look very similar and do similar things to the Bolsheviks in their autocratic context. And then if you look at Finland, which has a context which is like semi-authoritarian, but not, there's a parliament with limited powers. It's very similar context to Germany. Well, it turns out that, again, they try to implement revolutionary social democracy, the most famous exponent of which was Kautsky, but which was, also the main tenets up through 1910, maybe in some ways up through 1914, were shared by Luxembourg and Lenin. I agree with Ben's history of that. And it turns out in Finland, they implement this approach effectively and take power through electing a majority to the somewhat rump, somewhat real parliament in Finland, and using the legitimacy of this election to push for a radical democratization of the regime. And that, in the context of the Russian Revolution in 1917, moves beyond the capitalist property relations and is essentially, what I think we could term a socialist revolution through a different form of transition than existed in the rest of Russia, in which there was no parliament. There was not a democratic parliament via universal suffrage. The Duma had never had universal suffrage. It had very low legitimacy. It didn't even exist in any meaningful way by 1917. So it's just a very different context. The extent to which some forms of parliamentary rule shape the political context is important. And so I think the big lesson is, as Marxists, it's essential to modulate our strategy and tactics based off of a concrete assessment of the regime under which we live. And broadly speaking, it is helpful. I think you can differentiate between autocracies in which there's no real meaningful political freedom and no real meaningful parliamentary legitimacy or rule, what I would call like a low inclusion parliamentary context, which is like Germany or Finland, in which there is a much more legitimate parliament. It has limited powers. The executive branch oftentimes is maybe unelected or not responsible to parliament. There's a lot of anti-democratic, institutional forms. The extent to which universal suffrage is accepted is contested, which political freedoms exist are contested. There's quite a lot of repression in Germany and Finland. People forget this. This is not something resembling like a free democratic society in the way we would anticipate. And then something like a capitalist democracy, which is as an ideal type, includes a legitimate parliament based off of universal suffrage and basically uncontested political freedom for the most part. And this is where it becomes gray areas. These are ideal types, and then so you have to do a concrete analysis of the concrete society you're in. And I would just say in response to Gil, it's a bit of a straw man. I actually think that the United States is certainly like the least democratic of what we might consider a capitalist democracy by the metrics that I use there, which I literally just took from the main political scientists on this. I'm not making this up, like just even for political reasons. There's a very good book called How Leaders Mobilize Workers by Konstantin Vossing, which I'll drop a link into it. I just take his typology, and he's the person who did the most research into, in this period, the relative democratic legitimacy of these different forms with different metrics. And he says the United States, actually on the forms that mattered for the political struggle of working class people, the extent to which the working class was incorporated into polity is actually amongst, if not one of the highest in the world, the extent to which the working class saw itself as part of and looked to the existing democratic state. This is actually, this is part of the US story. Obviously excluded Black people, excluded women. There's no country in the world today or in the past that has a full capitalist democracy or that. So you have to modulate this. And I'll just say, I basically agree with you. And actually will show I agree with, and actually have been arguing this publicly, that we need to have a strong focus on democratizing the US state. And so just contrary to what you claim, I just want to clarify it so we don't have to get into like a fake, like a debate over things we actually agree on. I will share my screen just to see when this article that some people hate, I think it's fine, but obviously I'm biased, on why Kautsky was right and why you should care. I hope you can see this. I don't know if you can. You can yell at me if you can't see it. But so this is the conclusion. I say, what are the conclusions from why Kautsky is relevant? Well, reclaiming, I'll just read it to be a little pedantic because it was claimed I had a different stance than my own. Reclaiming Kautsky's strategy should prompt socialists to focus more on fighting to democratize the political regime, a tradition that has gotten lost since the era of the Second International. Whereas liberals and social democrats generally accept existing government rules and structures, Leninists have often been reluctant to proactively fight for major democratic reforms because they seek to completely illegitimate the current state. Democratic socialist Marxists, in contrast, seek to lean on and expand our current democratic institutions, virtually all of which were won by working class struggle, as a jumping off point for anti-capitalist transformation. In a country like the United States, with its extremely undemocratic political system, raising the fight for political democracy is particularly urgent. Okay, so I agree. I don't think we need to get into a terminological thing about whether there's a capitalist, maybe you're using capitalist democracy in a different way. I'm using it in a loose way to explain universal suffrage and basically that the norms of political freedom and universal suffrage are accepted, and that in that context, you would expect a transition towards socialism to pass not through obliterating the entire state and replacing it with something like a Soviet, but you would accept, because of the context, that people would want to use what existing democratic forms are and expand them. And basically the transition to socialism would require universal suffrage and parliamentary rule. I think we probably actually agree on that. And that to get even in that direction, you need a serious democratization of the existing state. I don't think anybody has argued, to my knowledge, that somehow you could elect socialists to the existing American state, and then that would in turn be a framework through which you would be able to implement socialism. So that, I think we just leave that aside. I think we agree on that. And actually, I really appreciate Cosmonaut and Gil. I think your stuff on this is great, and I think it's very good to make the case for this, particularly living through the United States right now, in which just the impasse of minoritarian republicanism, it seems as strong as ever, with the cutting back even of Biden's already not that great bill because of the Senate. There's just so many things that are undemocratic about the US that even to pass the things we need in the medium term to win like a robust welfare state, I do think are going to require combining the fight for reforms with democratizing the regime. So, okay, so agreement on that. The substantive points though, and this goes to maybe some of the more differences, is, let's take a step back, because I think Ben, I agree with a lot of the historical narrative. I don't agree with the criticism of me, but the substantive issue, I think, is politically, as far as like what we're looking at today, we have some points of strong agreement, which I won't go into, but it's just worth noting, like the importance of the Second International on class struggle, class independence, building organization, not just focusing on like disruption and mass action, combining electoral politics with non-electoral association building, having a strong press. All of these things I think we agree on. So I just flag that as and obviously, as I just mentioned, democratizing the regime. Like these are points of agreement. Where do the differences maybe lie? Maybe it's ungenerous, but my impression from Ben's argument, and maybe I don't know the extent which is shared by comrades in Cosmonaut, but it's my impression, is that there is maybe an assumption or an explicit articulation that the core strategy of revolutionary social democracy, which is to say like the left, Marxist, tendency within the Second International up through 1914, like some of these core tenets, is more or less applicable to most advanced capitalist countries today. Like it seems to me that this is sort of a core contention, and that I'll try to lay out, what this means practically. But the broader historical point to say is the depth of the context differences are tremendous, and which is, in the era of the Second International, people forget universal suffrage is like the norm in 3 countries, maybe of the world, like France, the UK, maybe Switzerland. Everywhere else, it's like not accepted and being, and it's not the norm. And so the Marxists of the Second International actually also think, like a lot of Marxists did before, that it would be quite hard to even win under capitalism the acceptance of universal suffrage, things like this, that the fight for some of these basic democratic forms would push past capitalism in a way that hasn't quite proven to be the case. But that's not the main criticism. I think some of them could envision, looking at the British case, what this might entail. But that's not the main problem. The main problem, and this is to me where the tactical differences arise, is that the assumption of the revolutionary social democrats in the Second International, Kautsky, Lenin, Luxemburg, all of them, and in some ways going back to Marx, is that the processes of capitalist development combined with the subjective intervention of Marxists and the capitalist, with Marxists and a socialist party, would create, relatively soon, or at least as a viable midterm orientation, a majority of the population that wanted socialist revolution. Like this was very much the orientation, is that basically the process of class polarization, industrialization, combined with propaganda and organization by socialists, would lead you to be able to win a majority for like intransigent socialist politics. This was the line of Kautsky. It's funny that people call him like a reformist. If anything, and this is sort of my criticism, I think his policies were correct for a context like Germany or Finland, in which parliamentary rule was like, pretty modest, and in which there wasn't really space in the short term to win significant social reforms, and in which the push amongst workers, was pretty alienated from the existing state for obvious reasons. It was, it was an autocratic state essentially. And so in that context, just to be really specific about some of the tenets that I don't think are relevant, the revolutionary social democrats, because they felt like the key issue is how you're going to win this majority, and you were going to be able to the revolutionary transformation of society, the emphasis was very much on preaching the final goal of socialism. This was like a central thing. And Kautsky, this is one of the debates with the revisionists, is Kautsky said, well, look, you're downplaying the kind of preaching of the final goal, right? When this was because he thought, you know, you were going to be able to win a majority by preaching the final goal. This was an assumption. It was a totally viable assumption, but we have to look at the historic record to see whether this was proven to be the case or not. And unfortunately, the big story since like 1917 that I think maybe comrades have to grapple more with is that this imminent revolutionary majority did not arise in contexts of universal suffrage. It didn't even get close. And not in the sense that Kautsky envisioned, in which you win a majority to like the form of really revolutionary Marxist politics that he envisioned. We have to say that the majority of workers, unfortunately, and I very much think this is an unfortunate dynamic, tended to be more quote unquote reformist. You know, this is a loose term, but you know, basically we're hesitant to trade off waiting and patience for the final goal for the fight to win things in the short term. We've seen that for the most part in contexts in which it seemed like there was space to win things, workers were not willing to follow Kautsky and company's injunctions to kind of remain patient and to push for the final goal. And so this is, you know, I do have a big difference politically with Ben when he says, you know, things like fighting for the Green New Deal, or maybe you said fight for 15, these others, like we shouldn't get too bogged down in these, because you know, there's a danger of reformism here. You know, we need to keep our eye on the prize. Well, this is a legitimate strategy, and you can tell me if that's a straw man. I'm happy to. You know, I don't want to talk, but it seems like there's an emphasis on this final goal to perhaps, and you can explain your formulation, to the detriment of some of these fight for what I would call like transformative reforms, things like Medicare for all, Green New Deal, fight for 15, what have you. And so the problem is that there's no evidence in like the last 100 years to expect that that strategy will work out in the way that Kautsky had envisioned. We have to say that because this is the contradictory nature of capitalist democracies, there's more space to win reforms. There's enough of that, there's at least enough of a sense that this is possible, and enough of a there that workers are reluctant to hold off in pushing for things like a left government that could implement something short of socialist revolution, or to kind of just keep their eye on the prize in the sense Kautsky envisioned. And to be really concrete, I think it was good and necessary for to try to run Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. I think it would have been good if Jeremy Corbyn got elected. I think it would have been good if Bernie Sanders got elected. And we should be clear that according to Kautsky and revolutionary orthodoxy, social democratic orthodoxy, this was like a no-no. You should never, as a socialist, run to lead a capitalist state. The strategy was very much, you know, you need to stay outside of power at all times until you have this majority. And so the problem is, well, how do you win this majority if you can't prove to people that you can pass things? This is the contradiction. This is a dilemma. It's truly a dilemma. The response of, you know, revisionists was, turns out we can't win a majority unless we can deliver. And then in order to deliver, we need to be in power. That might mean making some compromises. It might mean making some alliances that are unsavory to your strategy. But the reality is we're not going to win this majority in any way unless we are able to take power under capitalism to the limited extent we can through the existing regime under capitalism. And that's going to create all sorts of contradictions. But basically our strategy has to be, in order to get that majority, we need to be able to start trying to fight for not just outside of power, but inside of power, even under capitalism, to pass transformative reforms. And we have to say, if we look at the world since 1917, which strategy seems to correspond more to the facts? I would say that like the massive growth of the welfare state since 1917, of just like off the charts, very hard for anybody in that era to even imagine. There's no comparable, and this is comparable existence in this period of the extent to which the existing capitalist state was able to provide all sorts of decommodified goods for all of its limitations that we know and probably agree on. This was real. There was a substance then to the democratic side of capitalist democracy. It wasn't just sort of like a sham, as Leninists argued. And I will, maybe in the interest of time, leave it with a few concluding remarks. The danger, I think, in the approach laid out by Ben, and I'll just say as a parenthesis, I don't think Lenin was like a pushist. I will save you the pedantic thing. I'll just put in a link if anybody wants to read it. I'll read you the quote. But it irked me a little bit because I actually explicitly touched on this point in the last article I wrote. I'll put it in the chat. Here it is. On whether the criticism of Leninism is that they're like Blancist and like insurrectionists in this sense. So I'm dropping the article in. I'll just read you the quote because it gets at, to me, what the difference between democratic socialists, broadly conceived, and what Leninist strategy is I'll just read the quote. The democratic socialist critique of Leninism is not, as some have suggested, that it's based on a fetish of violence or minoritarian Pushism or Blancism. Its main problem lies elsewhere. This is the main problem of Leninism. By dramatically underestimating the popular legitimacy and contradictory nature of real parliamentary institutions, it marginalizes radicals and made anti-capitalist social transformation less likely. And so essentially what Leninists did was provide an answer to the same dilemma that revisionists tried to provide an answer to, which is that the approach of the Second International Marxists did not lead to this revolutionary majority. It was not there. Leninists responded by saying, we'll win a majority, but it's going to be actually after we overthrow, we'll win a majority, through Soviets. It will be not instituted through election to the existing parliament. We're going to overthrow the entire state. This is state and revolution, right? We're going to create workers' councils and replace that. And we will get a majority, but you can't, and you shouldn't orient towards trying to register that majority under capitalism, right? So this is different. And then the revisionists say, well, look, we do need that majority, but it's not coming through preaching socialism. So we're going to have to build up power through winning structural reforms, intervening in the capitalist state, and it's going to take a different approach. So I would just say for comrades who want to assess whether these different approaches are useful or not, we need to look after the period of the Second International. We have to basically look at the entire historical record of capitalist democracy, if you don't like that term, whatever term you want to think about of most European and Anglophone states, to see what strategies prove to build up the requisite organizational strength that could make socialism possible. To me, this is the cutting edge question. What are the strategies and tactics that are going to lead our side, the working class and socialists, to get strong enough into which we can eventually get socialist transformation on the agenda? And I think the danger of Ben and maybe Cosmo, I don't know, this approach is that maybe it leans too much in the direction of propagandism, that there's a downplaying, maybe not rejection, but a downplaying of the fight for reforms, and that there's maybe a tendency to overemphasize the projection of the final goal. A lot of the stuff on democracy I find compelling, but if you're not going to find, you need to be able to make the fight for democracy legible to millions of people. We need to be able to organize millions of people. And so to give a concrete example, I don't think we're going to win a democratic republic in the United States by doing study groups on democratic republicanism. We can do that, but it's going to be through concrete experience of fighting for Medicaid for all, fighting for Green New Deal, things like this, that people will bump up against the limitations of the existing state. So we need to be able to combine the fight for reforms with the fight for democratization and keeping in that process a vision of socialist transformation. And that's extremely difficult to do. The reason socialism has not happened is not that we've lacked good strategies, but that our enemies are very strong, and the dilemmas of getting sufficiently strong that we can defeat them are very difficult. I would just suggest that last thing, people should look into the history of the Swedish Marxists, which I think they went the furthest in building up mass working class strength and moving in the direction where they could actually pose economic democracy in the 1970s as a plausible short-term prospect to millions of workers. And that experience is mostly ignored when we just debate the Second International. So you have to look at a little bit later and the limitations of everybody involved. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Oh no, last thing. This is just a plug. If you are interested in my forthcoming book, there's a discount, 40% discount. It'll be $16 US. I'm dropping the link into the chat so you can sign up. Just put your name in, and then you'll get the discounted version very soon. Okay, and thanks. I appreciate the debate, and hopefully we can clarify one way or the other.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, that was very interesting, very engaging. And I know I speak for myself and many a cosmonaut that we're looking forward to reading your book. So the format now will be that we want people to get, so we're going to go through one round of responses. I would say that Gil, you have more time than the others. And after that round of responses, unfortunately, we can't do two because we don't want to keep people here forever. But after that, we will open it up for Q&A. I want to remind people that, so you post your question in the Q&A. Please also specify whether or not you would like to read it yourself or whether or not you would like us to read it. And finally, please use a name, just for reasons of safety. We don't want anyone, we don't want any nonsense. So please put your name, and please keep the questions short if you're going to ask multiple ones. Having said that, I don't know who would like to begin responding. It'll be up to you guys. Otherwise, I'll pick. Gil, go for
Gil,
it.
right?
Okay, so I've got 3 points in response to Eric. I don't know if he's been watching what's going on in the Congress right now for the last 6 months, but to think that people aren't disgusted with this government, that it's not a democracy. I don't care what social scientist or political science you refer to. Democracy means one person, one vote. It has meant that since Tom Paine and the French Revolution. And to bring in this political science bullshit, to me, is just, it's ridiculous. You don't make excuses for the US Constitution. And it really lacks a lot of legitimacy. And you're just underplaying how disgusted the American people are with this political system. Okay, the second thing, the idea that the demand for democracy by Democrats or social democrats or Marxists depends in any way on the public opinion or the attitudes of the working class at a particular time just goes against 250 years of history. So 1848 in Engels' Principles of Communism, there's no voting anywhere. Okay, what does he say? The first demand of the communists is for a democratic constitution in Britain, in France, in Germany. The 1848 revolutions were demands for democracy. It just permeates all of European history and American history as well, with the Civil War and Reconstruction and the fight for equal rights for the last 100 years. To say that people aren't ready for that to demand a democratic constitution, it's necessary to explain the blockage of progressive legislation. So, we just totally disagree on this. When the discussion kind of drifts away from the original demand for the democratic republic into what happened in Russia in 1917, I think we lose the thread. For 100 years, democratic republic as an issue in Marxism has been lost. And it was buried. It was buried by Bolshevik theory and the Third International. It was seriously recovered in the 60s and 70s by Hal Draper and Neil Harding. It's taken a long time to be assimilated. Now, Lars Lee's book played a role in that, okay? But I think Harding's book is actually better in its focus on what agitation for a democratic republic involves. Okay, and the third thing, all of these references to European social democracy. European social democracy exists because of the US occupation of Europe after the Second World War. Europe are basically political provinces of the US empire. The United States allowed reforms in Western Europe to isolate the communist and radical parties as part of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And so you can't point to Europe as an example of how social democracy or democracy can be won. All of Gortz's stuff, it doesn't work. We're not a democracy. And the way that Europe got their welfare states, it's just disconnected. I mean, social democracy was destroyed by fascism, and Europe was only rebuilt because of the occupation of the U.S. Army. And so they don't constitute really sovereign political systems. So we face, again, I'll insist on it, we face the same problem that the Germans, that the French, that the Russians, that the British faced in the Second International. You say there's a difference between Russia and Germany because Russia was authoritarian, an absolute, monarchy. Oh, but the Germans had some elections. The Marxists of the Second International did not recognize those differences on the level of program and the primary demand for a democratic republic. That was a universal, categorical imperative. All of the different structural systems, yes, the tactics of the operations of the parties had to differ, had to adapt to the structures. But the overall goal of democracy was the same. And so again, this is just plain disagreement. It also extends to what is political independence. So I just have an article that's just been posted on the DSA Socialist Forum. And I also wrote an article for Cosmo a while back. That independence in the United States, we should declare that we're for a democratic constitution. We should support anyone, any candidate who doesn't condemn the Senate, who doesn't condemn the Supreme Court, who won't work for a democratic constitution. We can't explain what is going on in the world, what's going on within the United States, and the whole threat of, quote, fascism from Trump. That's being, again, what's the difference? Is Manchin worse than Trump? I don't know. He seems to be a facilitator. But he can only do that because we are already in a semi-authoritarian system. And so DSA and whatever progressive forces in the US, we have to stand up for democracy and not make excuses. And when you say we have to democratize the system, well, how do you democratize the system? You demand democracy. You make it part of your platform. So in the Socialist Forum article, I point out that at the recent DSA convention, the platform that was written says the United States, who claims to be the leading democracy in the world, is no democracy at all. Yet the electoral plank, number 8 on electoral democracy, says the US is a democracy. To me, this is a flat contradiction. There is no coherence. Let's say particularly in Jacobin. You can go from article to article. Some days democracy, someday we're going to get material benefits. Oh no, now the material benefits are being blocked. Just back and forth like a ping pong ball. It's our obligation to explain how this political system works, how there have been attempts at democracy in the past, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the reversal of Reconstruction, New Deal, liberal period of the 50s and 60s, the reversal of that. There has been an ongoing civil war in this country for 150 years. And we just have to be much more open about it. or people won't take us seriously. To talk about reforms and getting material gains, well, what are your means? How do you do it? I think we've just seen it in the Congress, around the social program bill. It's just being shredded. And so anyway, I could go on, but we need something to really, theses to nail to the wall, that we want a democracy and we don't live in one. And I think that should be the primary focus of the DSA and the entire left in the US. Okay.
Thank you, much appreciated. So why don't we have Ben respond?
Yep.
Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm not sure about the civil war for 150 years, but I'll leave that point aside. Where I think Gil is absolutely right, and I think the actually reflects one of the more positive and actually negative experience of social democracy in its own way. If you think about the political demands of the German SPD and indeed the Russian RSDLP in Russia, the first demand is always of a Republican nature, right? There's criticisms leveled by Engels about that being explicitly stated and all the rest of it. That's another discussion. But this is a point that comes up in 1910. And I think I should just quickly, because Gil made a criticism of me on that, I should deal with that very quickly. I'll just again share my screen. This is hot off the press, Rosa Luxemburg, because this hasn't been translated before. If you look at this quote, can you all see that? Yeah, I assume you can. If you look at this quote here, I think it's very, very telling. This is here in 1910, so it speaks to the controversy that Gil referred to at the start. Is it visible? Can I make it? Should I make it a bit bigger? Or is it okay? Can you read that? It says, until now, we have done bugger all for the supposedly self-evident cause of republicanism. So people on the SPD right were saying, well, of course we're for the republic, right? Of course we are. Who's for the Kaiser type thing? If the slogan of the Republic had been prioritized on all appropriate occasions, and systematic agitation would have sharpened the broadest party circle's understanding that the Social Democrat is simultaneously a Republican as a matter of principle, then it would either have been impossible for such a flagrant self-humiliation like that in Baden to have occurred, and what she's referring to is Baden SPD deputies who go to, who accept official courtly invitations from the Baden prince, right? That could have been avoided. Or it would have had caused such a storm of indignation in the Baden camp. But for decades we've completely neglected Republican agitation. I think that is one of the problems in the SPD. It was formally in the program, but it didn't find a concrete expression in the party's practice. So in that sense, I absolutely subscribe to what Gil says about the centrality of democracy. That must be part of any socialist platform raising these issues, and certainly, particularly in the context of America, I think America is the United States of America is absolutely crucial. Now, just on I'll be very quick on the tactical difference with the Gil. To me, Prussia 1910, Luxembourg and others make the tactical judgment that the struggle in Prussia can be escalated to challenge for power, right? Other people, I think correctly, say that even if it were to come to that in Prussia, we're not going to be able to generalize that across the Reich. It's more important now, a tactical decision to focus on the elections, to pull away from this mobilization for now and to return to it in the future. That's how it was discussed. But the problem is, ever since then, Kautsky writes this famous article, doesn't he, between Baden and Luxembourg, which is Trier, where Marx was born, right? And he said, so Kautsky makes that point, but in so doing, you see the seeds of him actually on the way to Baden a little bit, right? You do see that, but I do think it's important not to elevate what was actually a tactical difference, right, into a big strategic one, because technically, even in 1914, while Lenin then looks at Luxembourg's right and says, oh yeah, this is important, he still had the strategic and upheld the strategic outlook of Kautsky, sometimes in distinction from Rosa Luxemburg. So I think that difference between tactics and strategy is important into that debate, and I think sometimes a little bit too much is made of it, but like I say, I'm working on that at the moment, and hopefully that will be of interest to comrades. Now, really, thanks to Eric for listing out all these things, commonalities, differences, etc. I won't be able to cover everything now, but I've taken notes, and obviously I can return to this this video in the future as well. I think it's important. Can we win the majority? Was the core strategy right? I think the core strategy was right. I think that if you look at Germany, Austria, there are revolutions. They involve enormous amounts of the population. The political parties that were in opposition, radical opposition in the regime itself, come to the fore, right? They're projected into power, and I think then that's where things start to go wrong like slightly. I'm not saying, by the way, actually you're right. In terms of 1919, there wasn't an explicit majority for workers' parties, SPD, USPD, KPD, right? But I think you're extrapolating too much from these experiences and not seeing in themselves as contingencies that are dependent on a whole number of factors: internal, external, state of the movement, etc. So I think it's important to know what you're saying, but I don't draw from that then somehow we are forced to go down more of the, see the significance of the welfare status changing our strategy. You say, for example, we haven't lacked good strategies, we just had powerful enemies. I actually think that underplays the actual theoretical, political and organizational state of the left in the 20th century, given the defeats of the Russian Revolution, the defeat of the German Revolution, etc. I think we are still living in the shadow of those defeats, theoretically, politically, organizationally, as I mentioned, in a very small way in relation to the Second International, for example, right? That's just one of the various manifestations. So I think it's not a question of having, more powerful, and our strategy was wrong. Right? The 20th century was not a victory for the workers' movement, right? The strategy was wrong in a whole number of ways. In that sense, I think it's productive to look back at the Second International and see what was potentially good, what was not so good, right? And I've foregrounded some of those things. Just in terms of, again, I'll be very quick. Bumping up against the state, transformative reforms. In that sense, Eric, if you forgive me the expression, you still sound a bit like a Trotskyist in the sense that, you have this momentum of transitional demands. You mobilize the masses, you get them what's popular now, and then we kind of lead things along, and hopefully that will escalate. I think that is the wrong approach. I think it's shown to be the wrong approach. I think you have to start with your principles. You have to start with a clear vision, as Gil put it, in the sense of, how do we want to radically overhaul the state? What does that mean concretely? What is the democratic republic in our platform? And we go out and we patiently argue for that. Yes, so our ideas are in a minority, but I'm still confident that those ideas make sense, that they add up, that they amount to a democracy, and we can get there. It's a big haul, don't get me wrong, right? But I think just going for what is supposedly popular at any given time has also shown itself to be a dead end. Similarly, by the way, winning, I think you said, winning the majority also in power. I think generally the experience of socialists in power has been a disaster in the 20th century. And there are all sorts of examples, from national states to socialist parties that run capitalism, right? Even very recently, an example dear to my heart, leftist parties running local state capitalism, right? It's often in coalitions, etc. That is one of the strategic things which I think are absolutely crucial to take from the Second International. In terms of one thing, I think we have a certain commonality. We obviously have very important strategic differences, but one thing I think you're right on is we don't want to be fetishizing a particular form of the working class taking power. Right, because I think it's people say, oh, we need Soviets because democratic reforms in this society, they can't be transformed. We need something radically different. We do need something radically different. But then if you look at Marx's writings on the Commune, La Commune was just basically the local city council. The National Guard was a bourgeois militia that was won by the left in elections, right? So I think we have some areas to explore there, but it is about winning the majority, but then using that majority to bring about the democratic republic and not just tinker with the edges. But to get there, you have to start from with those openly declared principles. So yes, I am enthusiastic that can be the case. We just need to start doing it. Anyway, I'll stop there because I'm being told to shut up. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Yeah, Eric, if you'd like to respond, let's try to keep it to 5 minutes because it'd be nice to also have questions from people, and you guys can also kind of continue responding, obviously.
I will insist on going 20 minutes. Try to stop me. In response to Gil, I just have to say I found your response kind of baffling because I thought I made clear, and again I will reiterate that I think democratizing the US regime is extremely important. I've been arguing that, and I've actually organized around that before. And so it seems like either it's not clear to me exactly why you're so insistent that we have a breach on this. I'm not sure, based on what I said or what I've written or done, your insist on this. It seems to me tenable. It's not tenable to the extent that you think this is a difference. I think it seems to revolve around, you don't like the use of calling it a capitalist democracy. I'm in favor of like using a different term if you want, but there's a substantive issue, which is why I brought up the Vossing, which is like, we do have universal suffrage. That's not meaningless. We do have, for the most part, the ability to organize, and not get thrown in prison. That's not meaningless. It's what the civil rights movement in the United States fought for, was basically to extend the existing democratic structures of the existing democratic regime of the United States, whatever you want to call it, existing, whatever. The terminology is not important. The important question is the substance, to spread that to them. And it was meaningful. They were right. It did matter to be able to have the right to vote, to elect people, and to be able to not get murdered for organizing. So the idea that this is like the same as it's been 150 years seems to me is just all like the authoritarian regime that really muddies actually what are differences in context that are important to note, whatever label you cause. Similarly, the idea that this welfare state in Europe and Scandinavia was just like the imposition or created like by the US is like not tenable historically. I won't go into the whole history there, but it's just like not really based in the historical record. It can also explain why in the 60s or 70s, well after the occupation, in countries in which the US had no demonstrable direct impact, that's when in the 60s and 70s you have some of the biggest surges in welfare state in response to workers and socialist striking and organizing. So this is not a useful framework. And I'll just after my intervention, I'll drop a few links, not because I believe political scientists are smart per se, but I think we should look just at data. We can assess whether they're right or not. And on that basis, come to our own conclusions. The question is, how do you get a strong majority of people in the United States interested in democratizing the regime? To me, this is a very good question. I'm not convinced you can do it just by propagandizing for it. I'm for propagandizing for it, but it seems to me that much more likely that we need to combine that with fights around people's material needs, and in that process, expose the limitations. The reason people, for instance, there was a threat to pack the court, for instance, in the 1930s, where it actually became a live question for whether you could pack the court to democratize the Supreme Court, one of the most anti-democratic institutions, was not because people made the case for it and socialists argued for it per se, although they did some of that. It's because they wanted to unionize and wanted to win material gains and democratize, improve their lives. And the Supreme Court was threatening to basically overturn the laws that would make unions legal. And so there's a relationship between the fight for reforms and the fight for democratization that I still think also maybe, Ben, this is maybe a point of disagreement, is maybe there's an emphasis on the like propagandistic preaching of it that to me is not borne out the emphasis by the historical record. I would like to see it more combined with reforms, but maybe this is a question of emphasis. I don't know on the ground if you actually abstain from reformist struggles or not. Maybe this is exaggerated. It depends on what you do on the ground. The final stuff, I want to respond in this question. Is there, my point was not that it doesn't matter what strategies we have. Obviously, I do think it matters. And I do think that the course of the last century is hard to disassociate from socialists having bad strategies. So it is extremely consequential. Leninism, I think, for instance, played a very negative role for radicals in disorienting people. Social democracy in the like reformist sense also, I think, was a dead end. And so I do think that something like a more like Marxist reformism, if you want to think about it that way, or whatever the Swedes were doing, to me, this is a strategy that maybe if it implemented more widely, maybe we would have seen more success. The point, though, is really specific, is that there's never been a socialist revolution in an advanced capitalist democracy. So we should be humble about our strategies, because ultimately, none of the strategies implemented thus far have resulted in what we want to see. So we should be careful about extrapolating from other contexts. And because of the unknowableness of what exactly the transition to socialism will look like, because of the absence of a clear formula, that to me, that imbues upon us an open-endedness to thinking about different strategic questions. It should be an open-endedness to not copy necessarily the tactics and approach of the Second International, and to learning from experience one way or the other. And I would add that because we don't yet have a strategy, like the Swedes didn't do it, I think they got closest, but they didn't make it. So that's my point, is that we haven't gotten there yet. And I will end with this. We haven't gotten there yet because the tensions, and I'll put it this way, both the working class turned out to be in context of universal suffrage, if you don't want to call it democracy, less inclined to accept our preaching of socialism than we would have hoped. And then in turn, then you have to fight for reforms. And the dynamic between how you fight for reforms and then move towards socialism is extremely hard to navigate. And to think that we have a formula for that is, I think, not vindicated by history. And we need to grapple with that as we go through experience. And, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was great. So let's turn to the Q&A session now. If the question does not address, the speaker or a speaker or, couple or whatever, feel free, all of you, to weigh in. Let's try to keep it to like 2-3 minutes per response. I know. And I'm going to start off with people who themselves want to speak, so that other people can talk besides me. I'm wondering, are you guys okay with going 10-20 minutes over the allotted time until 5, just so that, we have many questions, many of them are good, and I want you guys also to continue responding to each other. So I don't know if you guys are okay with that. Be honest, please, or if you guys are busy, Okay. We'll really try to aim for 5, maybe 5:10. Okay. Yeah, we will. So having said that, the first question is from, and also please, for your questions, if you ask many questions, please just try to ask, a few, not too long, in the interest of time. So having said that, Rebecca, would you like to ask your question?
Can you guys hear me? Hi, can you hear me?
We can. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Hi, my name is Rebecca. I'm actually coming in from, I'm a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society, and I love these kinds of events, kind of like getting a whole bunch of leftists to disagree with each other and maybe work through kind of historical disagreements is great. Love it. Thank you guys for putting this event on. So I did have a question, I think maybe about the implicit metaphor we're drawing between the Second International and what seems to be like the DSA specifically, right? So I think there's like this impulse to use the Second International as a template of like socialist organizing, right? And and putting forward demands towards leaving capitalism, who knows? But I think what's important to highlight is that with the Second International, it's a genuinely internationalist project that's composed of parties that subscribe mostly to a Marxist ideology with hundreds of thousands of members, right? So I guess my question is how maybe just reflect a bit on like what is justifying this metaphor between the DSA and the SPD at the very least, and then maybe the question of international socialist movements specifically towards overcoming capitalism. And that goes to a second question, but I'll just leave it at that because I know there's a lot of other people who want to ask questions.
Yeah, thank you. We took like 25 questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. I'm sorry. So the next person, well, let's take 2 more questions, and then we'll have you guys respond in a round. So having said that, let's take, I believe Peter Glover wanted to speak. So go for it.
Hiya. I'm trying to find my question now. I'll put it up there. Sorry. Yeah, the first one is, what single, I don't know about the USA, from Liverpool in the UK, what single democratic demand or 2 would you prioritize in the USA? And that would mean, I think in relation to what Eric was saying, what sort of movements are out there? I don't know enough about it. And the other one is, you might all ask this, but it's for Ben, what single democratic demand would you prioritize in the UK? Currently in my union, the NEU, I'm trying to get unions to take more risks with taking industrial tribunals. It's an extremely small piece of the jigsaw, but where I'm coming from, because I'm an NEU activist, it seems really important to use the enormous funds that unions have got to do something with workers' rights. That's not happening. So that would be my two. Sorry, that's my own pet thing, but I just wanted you to comment on that. Thank you.
So the next person we will take is Michaela, if you would like to go. Michaela, are you there?
Yeah, I just got the unmute. Okay, hi, Eric. So I'll just read it off. So Gil, you mentioned that demanding a new constitution in the United States is a linchpin for demanding more or a more genuine democracy in the US. Despite the negative opinion of governance and the institutions that you mentioned, currently opinions of the Constitution remain very high across the ideological spectrum. In fact, colleagues of mine have referred to it as Constitution worship. And then also, most calling for and who are actively organizing for a constitutional convention are rank conservatives who want to, for example, amend it to include budget neutral spending requirements that would devastate social spending and potentially do all kinds of other mischief. So I'm just wondering about what your strategy is for getting around these two fairly large barriers, particularly given that this is kind of a centerpiece of your concept of like what that could look like. And I would also welcome other folks to weigh in on this if you have any ideas. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. So if the panelists would like to respond, please keep it, 2-3 minutes. Anyone can go for it. I don't know.
Gil, do you want to go first again, quickly? I'm happy for that.
Sure, Gil,
Okay.
go for it.
I'll say something. So Rebecca, the Second International is, I don't know, a model, a template. I don't look at it as a model or a template. What I find in the Second International is an extraordinary development of the concept of democratic agitation, primarily by Lenin. He's got an article called Political Agitation and the Class Point of View, which I think is probably the most important Marxist writing on politics that exists. However, I place all of this, the age of the democratic revolution that began with the American and French Revolution is not over yet. And so what the Second International had was the most developed struggle for demand for the democratic republic. World history got thrown for a loop by the First World War, Depression, fascism, the Second World War, and we still live in the wake of all that. We need democracy in the United States. It's just very simple. And we can learn from all kinds of Democrats in the past. Tom Paine, William Lloyd Garrison, the radical Republicans, Eugene Debs, Lenin, Martin Luther King. So anyway, so democracy is alive. We have to fight for it. I mean, that's I find Lenin's writings on democratic agitation extraordinarily useful. Okay, I'll stop on that one. I guess, so this, I'll go right down the list. The single demand, Michaela, one person, one vote. The House, elected by proportional representation, the abolition of the Senate, the denial of the Supreme Court to reverse democratic legislation. It's all very simple to me. And maybe I got that out of order. That was Peter. And then Michaela about constitution worship. So I was a member of SDS in the 60s and grew up during the period of the Cold War. And people like I.F. Stone, C. Wright Mills, Martin Luther King, things were not favorable at that time for putting forth democratic ideas. The state of the country and public opinion did not stop them. They did not compromise on their principles. And if there's constitution worship, we have to fight it. If the Republicans are strong, we have to fight it. We stand for democracy. We stand for universal human rights. There's just no reason to compromise on the principles. Now, so also in response to Eric about we have universal suffrage. Well, of course we do. And we should use it. We should use it to advocate for democracy. My point is, there is a big difference between the principles and then the tactical situation in which we have to operate. The principle of democracy doesn't change. It's not affected whether we're fighting fascism or we're in the middle of the New Deal and maybe there's progress happening or something. Political independence means sticking to those principles. And I don't think it's propagandism. And that's what's, I think, so great about Lenin's example in Iskra, or I.F. Stone in the 50s and 60s. You read that stuff and you're inspired, regardless of the situation. So I'll stop.
Just very quickly, I mean, obviously, for the reasons I outlined on my slide, I don't draw a direct line between the Second International and the DSA. Democratic demands for Britain, clearly abolition of the monarchy, abolition of the House of Lords, proportional representation, annual elections. Then you go further down the program, the abolition of the standing army and the police force, etc., etc. These are part of the whole things. Now, Eric might say that's propagandizing, and of course, like to say, we want to abolish the standing army. That's propaganda, but it's still a key, must be a key pillar of our approach in formulating working class independence. So those would be my demands there. And just lastly, on the Constitution from the comrade, I can't remember your name, but the about the point about the Constitution, and that maybe I think from my reading of American politics, it's far more likely that the American Constitution will be overthrown or overhauled by the right at the moment. I mean, that's clearly, that's clearly on the cards without being too fatalist about it. But that makes it all the more necessary for us to put our own constitutional alternative forward. And I think that's the point that I'm trying to hammer home here from the more positive aspects of the Second International. Working class politics was not just seen as reforms to material needs. It was put in a framework of how are we actually going to change the world, and agitation, propaganda, education, they all fit together, but you need that programmatic framework within which to do it. I've spoken so much, so I'll stop now. Eric.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick as well. So I agree with Gil on the major demand. Seems to me like in the Senate, or somehow make it equal votes for everybody, which would entail the same thing, but there should be no Senate and the Supreme Court. Proportional representation also seems to me pretty important for a long-term goal. Like maybe it's not as immediately necessary, but there's strong evidence that proportional representation makes it much easier for the left to build power and to win things than first past the post. So I think we agree on that. And I agree with what Ben just argued, that I think in response to Michaela, it's a problem that the right has taken the lead on fighting to change the Constitution. This is a real problem. It's starting to change a little bit. Like liberals talk more than they used to about democratizing, voting rights. There's the Democrats put up in Congress some not completely insignificant changes that would make democracy somewhat more real in the United States. It doesn't go far enough, but there's some there where people are starting to think about it. I do think Marxists don't talk about it enough. And so we should talk about it more. The question still is an organizing question, which is, well, how do you get most people to care about it? That's less obvious than just, we agree we should have the propaganda. I say, like, my reading of the history, when you look at how democratic struggles have taken on a mass movement dynamic, it's almost always because they're deeply associated with social demands too. There's very few instances that I know of in which the political struggle is sort of an end in itself, or even the primary factor per se. So it's like, I've studied in Finland, for instance, the fight for universal suffrage. Well, the workers wanted universal suffrage in Finland because they wanted to pass the 8-hour day and basically prohibit alcohol. Like, for what it's worth, that was the other thing they really wanted. And so they saw it as an instrumental thing. They said, we need democracy to pass this thing, right? And so to me, makes sense, is that, the danger is people feel like political science, although democracy stuff can be wonky. It's like, oh, my American government class in high school or something. This is a reality. It's hard enough to get people to, like, take action on climate change, like the imminent possible destruction of humanity. It's not so obvious to people why they should care about this if it's not tied to social demands. So to me, I don't know if we disagree on that. It seems to me that there's a tendency in some of the formulations Gil and Ben said, maybe to divorce the fight for democratization from fights around reforms in the day-to-day. If that's not, it's not, I see Ben shaking his head, well, then it's great. So we agree, but it's not clear to me what the debate is. And yeah, I would say concretely, if we want people to care about climate, if we want people to care about democratizing the regime in the US, it's going to be by making it clear that we're not going to pass real climate legislation. We're not going to pass real racial justice. And we're not going to pass Medicare for all without confronting the anti-democratic structures of the US regime.
Thank you. Okay, so let's try to go for another 2 rounds. Unfortunately, I'm just not going to be able to select everyone's question, and I'm going to select the question based on, unfortunately, I'm going to have to select it based on what I feel hasn't been addressed as much. So no one else, it seems, wants to pose the question themselves. So I'm going to ask James Bierley's most recent question, which is DSA is a step forward, but a pretty contradictory mess at this point. Still better to have one than not, probably. Would love to hear the panelists' take on the platform and how it holds up or doesn't hold up to Kautskyan ideals. So that's the first question. I'm going to read another couple. Okay, James Tanzi, what do the panelists think about the idea that imperialism and the buying off of a section of the working class led to the collapse of the Second International? Does the current configuration of imperialism impact the extent to which we can draw lessons from the Second International? And then this one is a juicy one. Gregory Gabowski, on keeping elected officials in line. There's currently a debate within the US DSA over proposed sanctions against Jamal Bowman, a DSA member who has been supporting the Israeli occupation, though some, not me, will argue whether he is in fact doing so. Are participants familiar with this? If so, any comments related to today's topic? I understand this is very contentious and we won't have that much time, but those are the 3 questions for now. Let's have our panelists respond, 2-3 minutes, and then we can go for another round, and then we can finally wrap it up.
The same order as before, yeah? I'm happy with that. Gil?
Yeah, well, Gil go first, then Ben, then Eric.
Ben, go first.
No, please. I'm happy for you to go first. I think it's better like that.
Okay. So on the question of the first one on Kautsky, I kind of forgot the specifics and how it relates to the DSA. Again, I just repeat. Second International, the primary demand was for Democratic Republic. We don't have a democracy. Our primary demand should be the Democratic Republic. Okay. On imperialism and the buying off of the working class, I don't think the lack of revolutions in Western Europe, I don't think buying off is the right term. Why there weren't revolutions in Europe is a much deeper question about the development of capitalism, how much of the wealth was generated there, what was taken from the colonies. So I don't have much more to say on that. You can kind of transpose that to the United States now. Why don't we have an independent working class movement? Is because the working class is bought off? Is it because we exploit the colonies? It's a complicated question. I have no answer for it. My only solution is, again, we're in this situation where there are public demands. I mean, war is not popular in the United States, and yet we have wars. Medicare for all is popular, and yet we don't have it. So the disconnect between what people want and what they get has, to me, that is a central problem of the political system. So that's where my focus is. And on the Bowman thing, I've read some of the stuff. It seems to me it's you got to draw lines of demarcation. And I mean, the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians for 70 years now has been going on, and Israel is part of the U.S. military machine. And I don't think we can accept that. So on those three, that's just my opinions.
So yeah, the first one I won't say too much because I'm not massively off the top of my head familiar. I haven't read it for a while. The DSA platform. I do think the elephant room is the question of the Democrats and running independent candidates. That's something I think is important, and I would emphasize the need is as part of the program, the platform for this overarching widespread democratization that I've spoken about on various occasions. So I won't repeat the points there. Imperialism, I think it's simplistic, but largely in agreement with Gil. It's slightly simplistic to put it down to that. There are a whole number of material ideological factors involved, and I think the kind of bought off argument over it's again, it's one of those looking back in history and that's an explanation for this collapse. It's one of the factors involved, but it's one of many contingent, open-ended factors, and I don't think fully accounts for why the SPD played the particular role that it did, or eventually. I don't think that was the case. I think it was more a case of people trying to get into power and carry out their own particular project, and that the war kind of came as a crisis opportunity to do that. So there is something to it, and obviously you look at Lenin and Zinoviev's writings in Switzerland about the war and the international, but I don't think it accounts for everything. And sorry, Eric, and the just on the deputies, I've just been translated some Rosa Luxemburg. And she makes it clear that discipline in a proletarian party, in a left-wing organization, in social democracy, is absolutely imperative, because she likens the parliamentary representatives as kind of as part of the proletarian army. They're at the pretty exposed posts, right? So any transgression they make, any step away violation of principles that they make, exposes the entire party as a whole, right, and the proletarian masses as a whole. Whereas your ordinary worker that supports the party, votes for it, pays dues, etc., the ramifications of breaking discipline openly, of flouting the political platform openly, are far less than somebody who's a public representative of that organization. I think that needs to be taken care of. That's in the context of the Barden discussion that I referred to. There's a lot more about it than that, but I think that's, yeah, particularly people who are public representatives need to be kept under close command. Otherwise, you get the kind of SPD phenomenon that you had. I'll pass on that because time is running out.
Agree on imperialism. Bribery is not the best explanation. On DSA and platform, we have to be honest about what DSA is. The DSA is both extremely exciting because it's the first big mass socialist organization in decades in the US. On the other hand, it's still very fragile, and weak and not well implanted in the working class. And it's not a party So the idea that with the existing DSA, we're going to mechanically translate the relationship of the SPD, like the best organized mass working class party almost ever, to DSA is just like, again, to me, this is a good example of like why it's not that helpful to have the way we do politics being like, this is our strategy and principles, and then we look at just everything insofar as it ticks off what our existing sort of like metric and strategy is. Obviously you need politics and you need strategy, but you also need to have like a very concrete analysis of the conjuncture. And like, so for instance, DSA is not a party. Bowman and all of these politicians who got elected, aren't, they're not meaningfully part of the day-to-day life of DSA in a way that, some other candidates have been. The platform that was passed also includes things like as far as I know, abolishing the police. I mean, we're not going to run people in the United States and win if we actually insist that everybody who runs makes a call for or agrees with with abolishing the police. It's hard enough to get people to support defunding the police, let alone abolishing the police, independently of whether you agree with it or not. So you have to have a concrete assessment of the extent of where's consciousness. If you want to move people, the first lesson as an organizer is you have to understand where they're at, where your forces are at, and then on that basis, you move towards the goals you need. And I think there's an underestimation of that in some of these discussions. So like, no, I wouldn't be for expelling Bowman. The question is would expelling Bowman strengthen DSA and the fight for Palestinian liberation, or to be like a symbolic thing? To me, there's ways of accountability in this concrete circumstance, given what DSA actually is in our relation to Bowman and things like that, that don't require expulsion and like weird Twitter wars, but would be what's actually happening with organizers, which is like meeting with Bowman and talking with these issues and pushing him on it and, upholding our stance and saying we disagree, this is why we're for BDS. But the idea that we need to resort to the tactics of the German SPD for a different context, because that's like just our big P program, is not convincing to me.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to read two more questions. I apologize if your question was not read, but we do not have the time. So the first question I'm going to ask, and it seems to be a good follow-up. The discussion has so far held up the DSA as more or less the pulse of the American left. However, DSA total membership is around 85,000 members. My public sector union has 45,000 members in just my state alone, Washington. So my question to the panel is, instead of trying to steer and craft DSA-type politics towards a more revolutionary aim, and only speaking of democracy in electoral terms, why aren't we leftist, communist, Marxists more embedded in labor and unions instead of academia? Okay, that's it. Yeah.
There's a suggestion in chat, Eric, that you go first because you don't.
Yeah, because I have to get off at 5. What to me, this is a crucial question. Yeah, like the bulk of my organizing work and my background and like actually what I do on the day-to-day is around labor, particularly in public education. And yeah, to me, it seems essential. You're not going to have a strong socialist movement without a revitalized labor movement. So these two things go hand in hand. The question of how we do that is a good one. I think that the efforts of DSA towards sort of helping get people in strategic industries and doing the rank and file strategy is very positive. There's good efforts to help organize Amazon, Organize on Organize. I've been involved and helped found EWOC, which is Emergency Workplace Organizing, which is to help unorganized workers get organizing tips and strategy. To me, this is essential. Without a revitalized labor movement, we're not going to be able to have the transformations we need. So the question then is, how do you combine electoral with labor? How do these feed off of each other? Like that's the nitty gritty of organizing that is going to be essential for us moving forward. And I apologize, in 3 minutes, I do have to get off, but I just want to say probably the last thing I say. I really appreciate Gil, Ben, and all the comrades for the comradely discussion, and for everyone who's out there watching. I think more discussions like these will be fruitful.
Great.
Go for it, Gil.
Okay, so on some of these questions of, what are our numbers? We're small. How can we have an effect? So I grew up in the 1960s, right? And we had the Vietnam War. And the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed, I think, unanimously in the House and 98-2 in the Senate. And yet SDS stood up by itself and said, the war's wrong. They were accused of being communists, by the Johnson administration, by Congress people, and by Cold War social democrats. Okay, so we were a tiny minority. Now, actually, I wasn't there in '65. I was still in high school, but those were very small numbers. And SDS didn't put its finger in the wind to see which way the wind was blowing. They stood on principle, and the movement grew. Okay, so this question of, oh, well, DSA, you know, hold on, little ad. Okay, after SDS, after my college years, I did factory organizing in a Marxist-Leninist organization for 5 years. And many of the discussions that are going on now are exactly the same that went on then. What's the relation between trade union, economic struggles, political struggles? Where should we focus? And what was neglected, what the responsibility of intellectuals were, regardless of what the trade union movement was doing at the time. As SDS leader Paul Potter said, we have to name the system. We have to name it, analyze it, oppose it, whatever it takes. Okay, well, that's intellectual work. And the intellectual work does not wait for the mass movement. The idea that socialists are supposed to wait for a mass movement before it develops its analysis of the system and its strategy is what Lenin called tailism. It's economism. And it's just a travesty of what the best Marxists did. And so we're in this situation now of, okay, what do we do? My pathetic little answer is the first thing we should do is make the slogan, I want a democratic constitution. Put it on bumper stickers, T-shirts, carry signs at demonstrations, and engage people in the discussion of, well, what kind of world are we living in? What kind of system is this? Because that's where the discussion has to be, at the level of system. And if we lower it below that, we are just not fulfilling our responsibility. That's what the best Marxists did. And the people who I knew in SDS, that's what they did. And I think there has been an intellectual development since then. I mean, back then, people were functioning under the myth of Leninism. And again, Hal Draper and Neil Harding just destroyed that myth intellectually. Now, again, it hasn't taken hold within politics. It takes time. And Louis Project, who just died, he read Harding along with Peter Kameo and challenged the Marxist-Leninists against democratic essentialism for 30 or 40 years. Lars Lee also read Neil Harding, and that's what partially inspired his book on Lenin. And then Lee had an effect with Pham Binh and the International Socialist Organization and the Great Lenin Debate 10 years ago. And what you learn from those debates, I'll throw in Daniel Lazaire too, because his great book on the Frozen Republic, how the Constitution blocks democracy in the US, came out in 1996. There are articles in the New York Times, the Atlantic magazine, Baffler magazine, political scientists and legal scholars, Robert Dahl, how democratic is the American Constitution? Everybody knows it. And so it's our responsibility to talk about political power. And I think in some sense it's simple. We just put the flag and stand by it and talk about it of why we can't have a just society and a better world. To talk, I just, again, Eric's gone now, but again, Jacobin and the majority in DSA and their electoral stuff, we just have to get put forward these little demands and then we'll just kind of, build up strength. And I just think we see now in the political situation, it's bigger than that. It's much bigger than that. And I think people are ready for a political discussion about how our country works. So.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's all.
Okay. Just I'll be very quick because I need to go to bed. I've got to teach tomorrow. So yeah, thanks to both comrades for an excellent discussion, and I've taken extensive notes. I maybe get around to writing something as well at some point on this. I think maybe to bring out what I think is one of the differences in method, I think certainly between me and Eric, and maybe Gil is actually closer to me on this. As Marxists, we do not and should not start from where consciousness is, quote unquote, as Eric put it, in the development of our political perspectives. It's not as if Marx and Engels sat down, they write the Communist Manifesto, then there's the period of reaction, and I think, oh God, there's a period of reaction. We need to completely overhaul the manifesto and go for something new. No, they update the program according to situations, etc. But that's the point, is that Marxism as a worldview, and maybe we're wrong, but we proceed from our principles of how we think the best way is for class society to be abolished, for the working class to take power, and thereby bring about the abolition of class society, right? That necessitates certain principles and ideas that we work from and then get around to propagating and agitating for. Now, of course, when you're agitating in an election or in a trade union struggle, of course, you don't then come in and say this is our complete program and all the rest of it. You have to engage with what you see, and you have to talk to people, you have to be honest, but you also do have to say, well, this is actually our worldview, right? And that is what I think the left has been guilty of for far too long, is just saying, well, there's a big strike here, there's a big struggle, and actually what we can do, we can just we can fit in where people currently are at, and we can push it along bit by bit, and hopefully it'll go somewhere and we'll get to socialism or to the mass strike or Soviets, whatever. And I just think that runs counter to the experience of history and what we should be doing now. So I think absolutely it's principles first. It's providing a coherent program for how we think the world looks now, how we want the world to look, how we think we can get there in terms of our demands and what we raise in our program. And then we take that out, we propagate it, we educate around it, we produce pamphlets, we speak to people, all that kind of stuff. But the party question is absolutely fundamental, just to echo the comrade that come in on the comrade who's talking about his trade union. Why I would be in the DSA for all my criticisms of it, and I think this congressman situation is a joke, right? But why I would still be in there is because I think it's actually a serious struggle for comrades to work and put together the groundwork for a socialist working class American party nationwide. I think that's the chance it offers us, right? Maybe just to finish, and I'll finish with a quote. Again, I'm quoting Rosa Luxemburg a lot tonight, but and I have many criticisms of her, but this is her just talking about, this is the first paragraph of her pamphlet, Reform or Revolution, right? Because I think it relates to a lot of the questions we've been discussing today. And it's not as I'm taking Luxemburg as gospel or something, but I think what she says is profoundly important, right? She says, at first view, the title of this work may be found surprising. Can social democracy or socialists be against reforms? Can we counterpose the social revolution, the transformation of the existing order, our final goal goal to social reforms? Certainly not. The daily struggle for reforms, for the amelioration of the condition of the workers within the framework of the existing social order and for democratic institutions offers to the social democracy the only means of engaging in the proletarian class war and working in the direction of the final goal, the conquest of political power and the suppression of wage labor. Between social reforms and revolution, there exists for the social democracy an indissoluble tie. The struggle for reforms is its means, the social revolution its aims. You may be accused of propagandizing for this, but you need both, comrades. You need a party that's openly committed to an alternative constitutional order in the interest and run by the working class in that engagement of the reforms. And actually, if you really want to get reforms, you need to create forces that will scare the shit out of the existing order. They're much more actually likely to give reforms on one level. The history proves that as well. So I think it's a false dichotomy to say, you know, preaching revolution and all the rest of it on the one hand and not engaging with the masses as they are. I think actually both can be done, and the struggle for a political party in the USA and internationally is absolutely key to that. The program and principles and strategy that we're talking about, the strategic lessons of social democracy, not the tactical ones, again modulated to our own experience where we're starting from. I agree with that. No, you know, no one's saying copy and paste historical reenactment society. Each country has its own particular dynamics as well, but those underlying strategic principles we can assimilate, work on, develop, and organize around. And yeah, thanks to the comrades for organizing this discussion. I hope it's the first of many. And yeah, if you want to see more, I'll leave a link in the chat to my Patreon, where you'll find lots of Rosa Luxemburg. Also, the slides are up. My slides are just being uploaded to Patreon for everybody to see. So thank you again, comrades. Thank you, Gil.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gil.
Thanks,
Really,
Jen.
feel free to log off if you need to. And I really appreciate it. We at Cosmonaut, I think everyone can agree this was a very good debate, very good discussion. And yeah, we absolutely hope to have more discussions like this. So thanks so much.
Cheers, comrades. Have a good one.
Cheers.
Okay.
So for those of you still there, you know, we depend for our project on donations. And so check out, you know, Ben's Patreon, check out ours as well, Cosmonaut Magazine. You know, you'll get access to podcasts. We publish classic works. Recently, we published Nikolai Bukharin's Historical Materialism. This week, we actually have a new work coming out. It's called Anti-Postone. It's a criticism of Postone's ideas around anti-Semitism, how they've sort of been deployed and instrumentalized in or deployed within the context of Germany. And you'll also get, you know, some merch, some pens, some notepads and whatnot. So please, if you would help us with the project and contribute to our Patreon, sign up to our Patreon. And I really thank everyone for coming. I thought the discussion was great, and we will have many more like this in the future. And we hope to see you there. We hope to see your friends as well, your comrades as well. So take care, everyone.